So thank you for joining back, and I hope after the unit introduction that we have seen, you are able to now understand what is the logic of understanding and studying the, management of class dynamics. Now, in order to cover this unit, we are going to be looking at starting learning outcome 1 today, and I will just switch you over to the presentation, which will be used primarily to do a discussion on the various assessment criteria of this learning outcome. So these presentations are available up on Moodle along with the copy of the lecture recording. And for those of you who are not able to attend today, I would suggest that you go and review the recording of the lecture. And then if you have any questions related to what we have discussed in the unit introduction and learning outcome 1, I'll be more than happy to take them on in the next session. So let's look at the few key things that we want to look at in this particular unit. One is to understand what is classroom dynamics. So if you recall in the introduction, what I mentioned is that when we talk about the process of management is the process of dealing with or, controlling or, essentially dealing with people. So when we talk about management of class dynamics, what we are looking at is essentially here, talking about how we are going to interact with, what we are going to do is basically study the interaction and what is the level, type of interaction that tends to happen between students and teachers when we are delivering sessions or when we are doing teaching and learning as far as a classroom is concerned. Now, classrooms and, delivery of sessions could be done online in a classroom-based setting. It could be a setting in terms of a training or a seminar that you're attending. But essentially, the purpose of having and studying classroom dynamic is to learn how to set up a positive classroom atmosphere where students or learners or professionals are essentially feeling comfortable in the process of learning. And obviously, how do we communicate and make sure that the learning tends to be positive and inclusive, and there is a good level of interaction between the teacher and the student. Now, in the first learning outcome, the indicative content that we're going to be looking at covering is looking at activities that are done at different levels of difficulty to motivate students, and also how to make them interesting, and how do we look at stretching the learner in terms of asking them to do research, and be creative. We'll also be looking at understanding opportunities, how we can create opportunities through or basically how do we create activities in the classroom which will look at stretching the students' abilities, and that will pose a challenge to them to be able to think and effectively learn in a classroom-based environment. Now, in order to start this off, what I would want to do is basically look at a video which talks about the 13 different scientific strategies to help learners increase their learning. Now, this is the main motive, this is the main motive. So let me just put that video on for a second.
Hello and welcome to T.
So this is the main motive of, how do we look at helping the students essentially, say, for example, me as a teacher, my main aim is to create a positive and an inclusive learning environment wherein learners in my classroom are able to essentially learn and become, and essentially gain skills or knowledge from what I'm teaching and delivering. So when we look at managing and organizing the classroom in a way wherein it helps the students to increase and, better their learning, then is what we are looking at is basically talking about strategies to manage the classroom more effectively. So I'm going to play a video, which primarily is a 6.5-minute video, but I'm just going to play a bit of it to explain why this is something, important for us when we talk about the process of, learning and setting up the activities in a classroom. So let me just switch you over.
Teachings in Education with Frank Avella. There are 13 scientific strategies to help students increase their learning. Now, both teachers and students should become familiar with these methods, as you're never too late to learn. So we'll begin with the first box. First up is called spaced repetition. To stop yourself from forgetting information, see the diagram on the right, study the same material in spaced intervals. Here is a diagram similar to the forgetting curve diagram. where the y-axis is memory and the x-axis is time remembered in days. The graph shows that memory decreases over time unless you make repeated attempts to memorize it again. Notice it is done in spaced intervals. Number 2, the second box, is to read aloud. Read aloud to students and allow students to read aloud to themselves. This will increase their reading proficiency and increase understanding of the content. Research tells us that the act of reading and speaking text aloud will better help you memorize information than simply reading information silently. Moving on to number 3, the third box. Here is the flashcard effect. Flashcards use the learning process active recall, where individuals are given a question and then they must figure out the answers for themselves. Flashcards also utilize spaced repetition and self-reflection as you scroll through the cards and begin to check your own answer. Moving on to number 4.
So as you can see, this video basically talks about some of the effective learning strategies that we use sometimes in our classrooms when we are actually looking at managing the learner dynamics. So my suggestion would be to primarily go through this video, offline, because it will help you refresh some of the things that you normally do in the classroom-based setting when you're actually teaching and delivering the sessions yourself in the classroom. Now, let's bring our focus back in terms of, what do we mean by certain important things that are a part and parcel of this particular learning outcome. The first one is just to refresh, when it talks about understand the principles and practices of managing a dynamic classroom. So when we talk about this, what do we mean by that? We are looking at basically talking about classroom dynamics, and classroom dynamics involves the interaction between student and teachers in a community-based setting. What we're also looking at is extending this to building of relationships among students and teachers, which basically happens because you are in the same place and there is an association which gets built on primarily because the students see you or visualize you as a fountain of knowledge. So you are essentially delivering the teaching, and in this case the student is essentially learning. So when we talk about classroom dynamics, we are basically looking at fostering a learning environment wherein we are basically providing better opportunities to the learners to be able to learn, and we are encouraging them through the process of encouragement. They are able to actively engage with other fellow students in the class, with you in the class. They participate, and thereby this enhances their understanding of subject, and specifically in certain areas like the STEM field, when we look at teaching science or technology or English and maths related subjects. Now, the purposes of studying classroom dynamics is to understand how do we set up a positive classroom, how do we set up an inclusive classroom, what resources we look at, and why do we use these, and how do we use these resources rather than why, how do we use these resources to basically make learning more effective in the classroom. Now, a good dynamics, in the classroom is very important because it helps in setting a positive attitude, a positive behavior, and it motivates in general the learners to be able to interact with other learners and teachers in the classroom. Now, this is generally a requirement to be able to effectively teach and deliver in the class. So management of a classroom and the dynamics of it, which is basically relationship, attitude, behavior, interactions of it, is something which is a direct responsibility of the teacher when you're essentially teaching and delivering something in the classroom, whether it's online or whether it's in a classroom-based setting. Now, the other things which come into our mind is with regards to discipline. Now, every classroom should have a behavioral code in order to maintain order. We see that in schools when the bell rings and the class starts, everybody is seated, they wish, and greet the teacher, for example. You raise a hand when you're wanting to ask a question, you say, excuse me, for example. These are basic behavioral codes in order to maintain an order in a classroom. Now, students should always be, feeling comfortable that they are able to express themselves in the class without having any, let's say, inhibitions. Teachers should inform students at the beginning of the class in terms of what their behavioral expectations are. So generally you would see at the start of the term when new teachers are assigned to classrooms, or different classes, you would generally see the code of conduct, some of the basic set of expectations is explained by the teacher, and that is what is expected by the learner to follow. Setting this code basically helps to set up a particular behavior, and attitude, and the classroom environment in general. And if the student breaks that rule, it is important that teachers follow through on what they have explained as predetermined consequences. Now, when we talk about classroom dynamics, we talk about discipline, we talk about motivation. Now, motivation is important because the learners should feel motivated to come to the class, to attend the class. They should also feel that the teacher makes the class and the teaching side of things very interesting in the class. So, for example, the use of activities, discussion points, sometimes use of props are done essentially to keep learners motivated to be able to attend these sessions. And when we look at the different interests and talents of the learners in the class, the teacher needs to be flexible enough to be able to accommodate the students' individuality, but also to look at challenging and providing them opportunities to be able to complete those tasks, participate in terms of interactions, and that keeps the student and the classroom motivated and positive in terms of setting an environment. And that is what we also would term it and relate it to classroom dynamics. Now, sometimes what we also see is that we sometimes use gender, and this could be a tool wherein, for example, people might feel embarrassed, they might feel isolated, and in some cases, some of the activities which are carried out in the class tend to be, creating that atmosphere. So, as teachers, what we need to be able to ensure is when we talk about inclusive classroom, we need to ensure that we are able to listen and take into account requirements of any and all learners in the classroom, so that they might not feel left out, or they might not feel, for example, that they are not being, they have been given a different behavior or a different set of rules follow for them as against some of the others. So an example that I've given here is in the case of a medical school, if a medical student is listening to the lecture, and obviously, as a case in point, if a girl student is, for example, having periods, then in those cases, the teacher might need to step in. And if the student is not feeling well, the teacher might need to step in and obviously allow, allow for the student to, the teacher should be able to understand the situation and allow for the student to take rest or take leave. And that should allow this to be an inclusive practice. That means you are conscious of the fact that there are students who are not feeling well, or maybe they might not be feeling well, and essentially you have taken the first step to make sure that the student situation is recognized, and that recognition of situation allows the teacher to make the student feel less embarrassed, or saves the student from embarrassment. In some cases, this is something which is required to maintain classroom dynamics, and obviously teachers need to be sensitive to that aspect of particular requirements. Then we also talk about participation. When we talk about classroom dynamics, it is important for the teacher to understand that if we are to carry out discussion and activities or any sort of activities in the classroom, the teachers should look at gauging individual students' interest. They should encourage participation from all the students, and they should be looking at ensuring that students which are not participating, or children which are not participating, learners which are not participating, we should be getting into reasons of understanding why they are not doing so. And the dynamics of the environment or the activities should be changed in order to make it more inclusive or more favorable for these students who are feeling left out or not able to participate because of being shy, for example, or because not enjoying the activity, or feeling left out in terms of not having to understand what the activity requires them to do. Now, maintaining classroom management using participation, ensuring gender neutrality, ensuring motivation and discipline, and setting the expectations with the students allows you to effectively create a better classroom. That would mean also that the interactions that you have with the students, the relationship that you build with the students are going to be positive, and they are going to help promote let's say promote a positive learning environment. And these positive learning, and obviously these characteristics would influence behavior and motivation of children to be able to attend the class as well. So when we look at that, when sometimes we fail to recognize the behavior or the attitude of the students and do not take appropriate actions to inform them to change our instructional strategies in terms of how we manage the classroom, can lead to demotivation and low interest from the learners to be able to participate in your class. And sometimes we see the problem of absenteeism is because children or learners feel that, no, I just don't enjoy the session, I just don't like the teacher. And that gives you a sense in terms of a feedback that you need to look at, including the say, for example, including I'll put it this way, I need to go back to the drawing board and look at how do I pick up individual learners, their interest, their background, and obviously look at what interests them and encourage them then to participate and be a part of your class. And this would essentially also be mirrored in when we talk about things like safety. So when we look at people essentially, or students essentially attending your class, they need to feel safe in your classroom. That means your classroom needs to have very clear standards, consistent in lines with the requirement of the school, college, or the institution, and that should be conforming to the behavior of teachers, which is required as a code of conduct. And this allows the class to be productive, which also means that the students here feel that they are protected, they do not feel vulnerable, and obviously they feel safe when they are in a particular classroom learning from you. Now, we also look at some definitions that we are putting forward, because what I would want to do is talk about some of the key aspects. So here, one of the key aspects that we look at of classroom dynamics is to understand positive class learning environment and how do we build it. Now, students can be more productive if they have a conducive environment, they have a positive class outlook towards the class, and their behavior in terms of ensuring that they are the management of the behavior by the teacher in the class also allows let's say, in a sense of atmosphere to be created wherein there is mutual respect and there is respect amongst other colleagues within the classroom, and this allows students to feel more free, and they are more likely to participate and let's say contribute towards the learning in the classroom. Now, we would also look at that sometimes more teaching time in terms of teachers spending more time in teaching and setting up positive aspects of teaching, which could be through activities or group activities which allow learners to mingle, and also to interact with each other to be able to learn skills, would be more productive. And this, if it is done by balancing the use of resources, ensuring that the activities being carried out are meeting individual interest and levels of the different caliber and level of the students in the class, would also allow the teachers to reduce misbehavior and also increase motivation in the classroom. So this generally tends to be one of the key aspects of looking at building a positive classroom. Last but not the least, what I would do is mention, when we talk about classroom dynamics, we also talk about relationship building. Now, through managing the classrooms effectively, teachers can actually build a healthy and a mutually respectful relationship with students. Now, this is seen as a case in point example that if your lectures are interesting, if your lectures are interactive, if your lectures have the right mix of questions and activities and icebreaker sessions, you generally feel that the students essentially enjoy being in your class. So they look forward to eagerly attending your sessions. They are forthcoming, they are prompt in terms of attending your class and obviously being attentive, punctual in your class. And this shows that there is a good relationship building between the teacher and the pupil or the student, and this allows for managing the dynamics of the classroom in a much effective and a better way. So all these aspects that we talk about in terms of relationship building, positive classroom environment, sorry, safety, we talk about, participation, we talk about gender neutrality, we talk about motivation and discipline. They are all a part and parcel of how the class dynamics can be managed within a particular setting. So any questions at this stage? Right. Now, with this basic bit of understanding in terms of the management of class dynamics and what are the key components of managing it, in terms of the points that we've discussed in slides like relationship, positive classroom, safety, discipline, motivation, participation, gender neutrality. Let's go into some of the assessment criteria to discuss a bit more in detail of this learning outcome. Now, the first one talks about analyzing the characteristics of group environment that facilitate learning and development. Now, what do we mean by characteristics or of group environment when we talk about this? Now, there are 5 different characteristics of a learning environment. What are these 5 different characteristics? They tend to be, say, for example, flexibility. We talk about, accessibility. We talk about participatory teaching and learning. We talk about trust and rapport. We talk about things like problem solving and critical thinking approach and the use of technology. So when we talk about the characteristics of a positive learning environment, what we are essentially talking about here is, things which are going to be critical components of how skill-based education can be delivered within a classroom-based setting. A positive learning environment can also be created by using, participatory teaching and learning techniques, wherein there is a building of trust and rapport amongst the students and between the students and the teachers. Now, this establishment of trust actually leads to true participation and engagement in learning when we talk about, a classroom-based setting. So when we talk about creating positive learning environment, it begins with teachers being, carrying out, essentially, I would say doing or carrying out their own self-reflection. They continue with some of the following up of some of the best practices that they look at bringing into the class, and to a certain extent when they look at meeting their lesson objectives and mapping them up to the requirements of the implementation of the curriculum. Now, positive classrooms or positive learning environments are always a work in progress. That means you would need to maintain this environment, you would need to develop it, you might need to make changes to it to ensure that this is meeting and meeting the requirements of the students in a particular class. Now, when we talk about group learning environments and what they facilitate, what we are essentially talking about is the development of educational settings which are going to be important for the purposes of ensuring that the teaching in the classroom is effective. Now, one of the prominent frameworks that was related to the characteristics of group environments and that facilitate learning and development in the classroom was what I think it's a bit of a tongue twister, but Vygotsky's social cultural theory. Now, Vygotsky's social cultural theory emphasized the importance of social interactions and collaboration in the learning process. So some of the key characteristics that he proposed in this particular framework was looking at the group environment that facilitates learning and development. And that is what has formed the basis of his framework. Now, he talked about things like zone of proximal development. He talked about scaffolding. He talked about social interactions, collaborative problem solving, and looking at, taking feedback and ensuring that we are able to then look at, ensuring that, say, for example, we are able to take constructive feedback, and this is then reflected on their work in order to make improvements and also to develop a deeper understanding of that subject matter. So when we talk about the concept of group environment, specifically in general, what I would suggest is that we need to be looking at this particular model of, a theoretical framework of the Vygotsky's, social cultural theory. And this theory that he proposed, was primarily, paid emphasis on essentially the social interaction and collaboration in the learning process. And some of the key characteristics that we talk about, which are included in his framework, the key characteristics, if I write, included in his framework are, so the first is zone of proximity learning. Then we also talk about scaffolding. So there's a particular handout that I'll be able to provide, in terms of social interactions, which are obviously related to the group environment. We talk about the collaborative problem solving. We talk about peer feedback. And we also talk about diversity of perspectives. So diversity of perspective means, groups that essentially, bring together the different, they're coming from obviously different backgrounds, and they have different experiences, will then have different perspectives. And this diversity in the classroom can actually enrich discussions and also expose learners to various viewpoints, and thereby enhancing the learning and development. So when we talk about this particular, aspect of the assessment criteria 1.1, which is the characteristics of group environment that facilitate learning and development, we need to be looking at Wojcicki's social framework theory, and that is important to understand how these play an important part as far as the facilitation of learning and development is concerned. Now, let's look at an example to cover this particular assessment criteria. One of the examples that I would normally give is that, say, for example, I put a number of students onto a science project. Now, in the science project, then they need to have what is called a collaborative setting. Because, for example, if you imagine that I've given a group of students some sort of experiments to carry out in a chemistry lab or in a biology lab, then what we are looking at is we have created students or asked them to go into groups, and these groups would then mean that the students would need to interact with each other, understand who is doing what, who's taking the responsibility, and who's doing what steps have to be followed as a group or as a member of the group to be able to carry out this particular experiment successfully. Now, when we look at giving them a group project, and in a collaborative setting, when they are in a lab, they would use different scientific concepts, the learnings that they've done in the classroom, they would experiment together, and then obviously what they would do is share the findings. Now, through these interactions that are happening when they are actually doing the experiment, they are using their concepts and also doing the experiments together, they are going to be having interactions. These interactions will not just be interactions in terms of discussing what they are doing in terms of the activity, but they would be personal interactions. There would be interactions related to the concepts, the theoretical frameworks, and these interactions would deepen their understanding of the subject, but also help in developing teamwork because they need to complete this project. They would also be effectively communicating amongst themselves, and they would be utilizing their problem-solving skills in order to complete the project. So when we look at all these things, that would essentially mean that they are using Wojcicki's social cultural theory in terms of ensuring that they are then essentially using the group environment, this particular science project which has been given to them to complete, and this would be facilitating their learning and development. And the idea of working together as a team, communicating effectively, and then using their individual problem-solving skills to bring the project to a close would allow them to have a sense of accomplishment as well. And that is what would be required when we talk about the characteristics of group learning environment that facilitate learning. Now, we could look at talking about some of the key aspects of how the learning and development tends to happen, and they would be looking into understanding the participation they do as a team. But that means they are able to work together as a team, and it encourages, and as a teacher, what you do is you encourage collaboration, you encourage communication, you encourage participation, you allow the building of trust, between them, between students. And this sense of trust then promotes open communication and obviously willingness to share ideas and resources and experiences for the purposes of learning and development. And then what, as a teacher, you also do is you bring inclusivity and diversity. That means sometimes when we group them into groups for activity, you bring learners together, somebody who's exceptionally brilliant, somebody who's good, somebody who's weak, you bring them together so that they can, learn from each other. And this would allow them to use their problem solving and critical thinking abilities. And this would also aid in the development of these skills, which will allow them essentially to become and understand and obviously facilitate learning and development for each of the individuals. So when we talk about essentially the characteristics of group environment, what we are looking at is the group environment in terms of learning and development prioritizes open communication, inclusivity, positive dynamics, and access to resources, thereby creating an atmosphere wherein the students essentially feel comfortable and they are able to then openly discuss and collaborate to essentially let's say learn from each other. Is that okay? Any questions on this? Okay, let's go to the second assessment criteria, which talks about evaluate strategies to manage group dynamics. So when we talk about this as a particular concept, what we are looking at talking about is when I use the word dynamic, what does the word dynamic mean? This is something which is going to be coming time and again in terms of our discussions. So dynamics word as a dictionary definition tends to be that it is a process or a system which is characterized by constant change, activity, or some sort of a progress. So a person's attitude is positive, that is one dynamic. The person is full of energy, that's another dynamic. The person is full of new ideas, that is another dynamic. So basically, when we talk about dynamic, what we are looking at is a force that stimulates change or progress within a system or a process. And that is what we need to look at when we want to look at evaluating strategies for group dynamics. Now, how do we go into this in a bit more detail? So let's look at the first is to understand what is the context of the word dynamics in relation to teaching and learning. So when we talk about the field of linguistics and semantics, we use the word dynamic here because dynamic here refers to how the meaning of words, phrases, or sentences can change depending on the context in which they are being used. And this as a concept can be closely associated with the field of pragmatics, which is basically in real life situations. When you're faced with problems, you get together, you work together as a team to be able to look at resolving the problem or coming up with solutions to solve that problem. Excuse me. Now, one of the things that we will look at in understanding dynamics is to also understand the relevance theory, which was proposed by Spiegel and Wilson. Now, when we talk about the theory of relevance theory, what we are looking at is that this theory is guided by the principle of relevance. That means the speaker's aim here is to convey the information that is both new and relevant to the listener. So from a classroom perspective, what you're looking at is, as a teacher, I'm looking at relaying information which is of relevance. And as a speaker, I'm going to convey this information to the listeners, which is going to be the students. So in the context of dynamic, meaning the words and expressions may acquire additional layers, meaning based on the specific context and the listener's inferential process. That means how would the students essentially be looking at, referring to that. Now, when we look at, the management of this group dynamic, we are looking at sometimes these things being very, very essential for the process of, team success. So how would you establish, group dynamics? You're looking at establishing it by setting very clear norms and expectation. You're looking at assignment of roles. That means people would clearly know what their roles and responsibilities are. You'll be obviously looking at doing, proper checks and regular checks, I would say, and then take or seek feedback, because this would allow you to course correct if anything is not going, as planned in the class. You'd also be looking at facilitating discussions, essentially, You'll be looking at team building activities, conflict resolution, and there are other aspects. For example, how do we comprise this group? What are the reflective practices, and obviously what are the channels of communication which are open? And all these points will essentially be looking at helping you manage group dynamics. Now, let's look at an example, of group dynamics. Because at the end of the day, what I want to do is basically look at an example of, how group dynamics can be seen in a particular classroom. Now, when we talk about a group dynamics, just as an example, you put a group of people together, which is number of students in a class, and what you do is you give them a particular task. Now, the way the students are influenced by their interaction and the other members in the group is something. What will happen is with regards to how they would behave and how they would interact in the classroom. So when we talk about managing the group dynamics, we are going to be looking into, say, for example, basic, things like how do we apply, for example, Tuckman's team building model, to a particular situation. Let's look at this way. If you were a teacher in a classroom, and then you're going to give certain activities to the students, what you're going to do is look at group dynamics. That means you're going to put together students in a particular group in such a way that you don't have somebody who's very aggressive or somebody who's very bold or somebody who has a different attitude in all being in the same group. So what you're going to do is balance the groups by including individuals of different personality, showing different attitudes, having different behaviors. And that way, what you're trying to do is create groups which are going to be balanced. And these groups are going to be then able to accomplish or manage the activity that is being given. And at the end of it, complete and learn from it. So this would involve what is called group dynamics, because this group dynamic would essentially mean that you would have to do a bit of work to understand who are friends, who are the students first, and for example, within those students, who are they friends with, who they like, who they don't like, and who are they able to work with, and who are they able to, say for example, positively work with. And that would allow you to essentially set activities and tasks and groups in a way which will allow them to, use their problem solving skills, use communication, use their team building skills, and essentially work together to be able to achieve that activity. And that is what you would be looking at in terms of an example of how do we manage sometimes, group dynamics. So in that context, you are going to know who the people in the team are, how they can tackle the problem, what strengths they have in certain areas, and then you define roles and responsibilities. You also look at focusing on, ensuring that there is open communication, there is trust and respect in terms of communication between children or students, and this would allow you to manage, group dynamics. So some part of it would be related to, ensuring that you are aware of, the team management or, team management models or stages of how group development or models can essentially work when you're trying to put together students into a group for an activity. And that could be falling back on Dr. Bruce Tuckman's team building model or stages of group development. And that allows you to, understand how and what dynamics would be involved in putting this group together. Any questions on this so far? Now, one of the other things that I could also mention with regards to, group dynamics would be talking about, things which are related to, say, for example, let's put it this way, the tasks and responsibilities which are carried out by a set of people in that group. Now, this would mean that individuals need to work together. Their psychology would be to look at, as a teacher, your psychology would be to look at putting together students in a group which will work effectively, cohesively, and positively. This would help in building interactions and obviously a positive relationship between them. And this could generally come from understanding their background, their culture, their motivation, their attitude, and their behavior, and their skill set, which allows you to put them together into a group which can work as an effective team. Now, Group dynamics can also be understood by this particular model, which is talking of group dynamics theory, which was proposed by Dr. Bruce Tuckman, and that is the theoretical model that you could look at, covering when we talk about the way in which some of the dynamics could be understood by you as a teacher when you are trying to put together, I would say, students into groups for the purposes of carrying out, activities. So you're looking at similar interests, you're looking at behavior, you're looking at their attitude, and obviously who they work with, who they work with well, and that would all be related to the group dynamic or the systems theory. Now, the third assessment criteria talks about, describing ways to involve learners in the management of their own learning and, development process. Now, what are the key things that you would do in the class is to involve learners in their own learning. How would you do that? You would be asking questions, for example, by doing a question answer session, which is where you're looking at tapping into their prior knowledge. You would do interactions with the students in the class or in online sessions to understand what their interests are, and this is to get them talking. You'd also be looking at designing activities or getting them into activities which would be motivating them. That means if students have certain types of interests and hobbies, then you'll try and obviously match them or at least make use of them to be able to do those activities in the class, which will allow them to see that this is something I like, this is something I like doing, and that would make them more engaging and more interactive in the class. Now, when we look at engaging them, when we look at obviously ensuring that they are involved in the activities, this would mean that they are essentially involved in the learning and development process. So some part of it tends to start with, when we talk about learners in group settings, looking at their self-assessment by doing a SWOT analysis. You might create an individual learning plan of a particular learner by understanding what are their strengths and weakness areas and put activities to the weakness areas to be able to improve them. You would look at goal setting for those students. Again, could be done through the individual learning plan. You would look at giving sometimes learners the choice to be able to go into certain groups, and that would allow them to feel more comfortable and obviously, more confident with regards to doing this activity in a group, which is where they can align with their friends, or they align with their friends because they have the same interest and obviously same motivation to be able to carry out those activities. So in general, when we look at describing the ways how do we involve learners in the learning and development process, what we are looking at doing is basically drawing out on some of the motivational theories. So we need to understand what motivates them, and in those cases using an appropriate say motivation theory like the Maslow's theory of needs or two-factor theory or theory X and Y. What we are looking at doing is aligning clearly the learning goals so that it is meeting some of the specific objectives that the group or the learner in this case needs to achieve or have. Their prior knowledge and interest would also be useful because this will allow you to essentially set activities that are done or built in such a way that it allows them to engage their curiosity and obviously the passion for the subject matter that you are teaching in the class. Now, we would also look at things like collaboration and discussion. We would also look at things like understanding, say, for example, how do we encourage them to share ideas, ask questions, and we would be looking at fostering a sense of ownership in their learning process. Now, one of the clear things that we look at in terms of their own learning and development is learning styles. So we need to look at the VARC learning styles, and these learning styles will help to identify and cater to obviously different styles that are present within a particular group. And some learners may thrive on, say, visual environment. Some might look at more auditory. Some might look at hands-on experience. And this would allow you to adapt your teaching methods to be able to make it more effective in terms of teaching and delivery more effective in the classroom. Now, one of the key components always tends to be feedback and reflection. So we encourage, obviously, learners to regularly do self-assessment and reflection, and this provides them an opportunity to evaluate their own progress, set new personal goals, and adjust their learning strategies in order to make the best use of it when they are actually studying in the class. So when we in general talk about ways through which we can involve learners to manage their own learning and development, we need to be looking at motivational theories, learning styles, modeling, their own behavior, and obviously looking at their prior interest and knowledge to be able to effectively, give them or set goals, and objectives for them to be able to achieve them successfully for the purposes of learning and development. So any questions on this so far? Right. This brings us to the last assessment criteria of learning outcome 1, which talks about explain how to manage barriers to individuals learning in groups. Now, when we talk about learning in groups, and obviously we've talked about the emphasis of classroom dynamics, we've talked about how to build a positive classroom, how to look at positive attitudes and behavior and communication within the classroom. Let's also talk about the other aspect, which is if there are barriers to learning, what could be these barriers to learning, and how these barriers to learning, could be leading to individual barriers for people within the group. So when we talk about, managing these barriers, we are going to be looking at, understanding how do we look at first, what are the barriers to learning? So one of the questions could be what, should come to your mind, that what are the barriers, to learning in a group. Because we know that, for example, the barrier to learning could be cultural barrier, communicational barrier, reading. For example, if I'm trying to read something, I can't make a sense of it. So as a learner, my barrier could be that I'm trying to read into something which is above my caliber or my level. And that could be a barrier. I could be, a simple example would be if I read a sentence and there are 2 complex words in it, I do not understand the meaning of those words. They could be a barrier to my learning. So in such cases, I pick up a dictionary, look at the meaning of the word, and then, understand the meaning of that sentence. And that would help me understand what the activity or the task is asking me to do. So when we in general talk about barriers to learning, what we feel is barriers to learning can obviously be hurdles, which essentially could be internal or external. Internal could be, say, for example, sometimes they could be emotional barriers. There could be barriers which are basically lack of your self-esteem, and they are or lack of focus, and these could be internal barriers. External barriers that you feel which could prohibit your learning in groups could be that you have peer pressure, for example, you have fear of failure, you also are, say, for example, looking at, intrinsic barriers, which could be mental health disorders or learning disabilities, and they would be all treated as, barriers. Now, what we want to do in this particular task is understand how do we manage barriers, when we talk about individual learning. So when we need to know about how do we manage barriers for individual learnings in group, what we need to be able to do in this case is basically talk about, let's say, if I put it this way, I think the best way to explain that I think I would do is basically start with an example. The reason I would do that is because when we talk about, barriers within that, what we are looking at is talking or going into things which are related to, for example, these barriers could be, let's put it this way, barriers in, communication. Barriers could be motivation. Barriers could be social engagement. Barriers could be, looking at you're not feeling comfortable within a group. So that is to look at group dynamics. So when we talk about these barriers, we are looking at, talking about the hurdles that you are facing in individual learning. And these could come from physical, mental, emotional, cultural, or other social elements which could obstruct you from achieving the learning goals. Now, how do we look at overcoming these barriers and how do we manage these barriers? One is we look at managing these barriers through learner-centered approaches. That means we are going to, look at your existing skill set. We are going to look at, when we talk about individual learning barriers, we're looking at my own skill set and what it requires to overcome, or what it requires for me to develop and then overcome the shortfalls in my skills that would allow me to learn effectively. Now, the other thing that I could look at would be starting with differing skill levels. That means if I intend to do a course at master's level, I might not have the knowledge and skills to be able to do so. So I might need to start at a lower level, and that would be looking at, starting at a lower level to be able to, build my skills, build my knowledge, and then go and progress to a higher level, task. It could be language barriers. Sometimes it could be that you have barriers because you're not able to understand the accent, or you're not able to understand what the teacher is saying or the tutor is saying, or in some cases your trainer is saying. And that would be because in some cases it might require that, because my accent is not acceptable or is not clear or audible to you, then in some cases you would need to resort to using visual aids, or simplify your use of. Sometimes when we say in teachers don't use jargons when you're teaching, is because not everybody understands the jargons or acronyms, and here the idea would be to make it simple in terms of our delivery, and that is where it could turn into a language barrier. You look at cultural differences. Sometimes you have people from diverse cultures, backgrounds, their values and beliefs tend to be different, and in those cases what you need to be able to do is contextualize your examples. So in some cases, teachers are asked to contextualize their examples when they give in the class, because they would then be easy enough for the learner to be able to understand, because they come from a certain culture, they have certain values and beliefs. Similarly, when we talk about other barriers in terms of managing individual barriers, we would look at barriers that could be individual, like anxiety, shyness. You could have barriers which could be related to your learning style. You could look at barriers which could be essentially related to, say, for example, lack of your prior knowledge, and they would be essential to understand and then overcome, so that your learning can be more effective. Now, we could also talk about emotional barriers. Sometimes when we talk about emotional barriers, what we are looking at is so when we talk about emotional barriers, what you're looking at essentially is, talking about a mental block. I would put it this way in simple words, that could influence influence how you perceive others and others' action, or in some cases, it prevents you from clearly communicating your feeling. And emotional barriers could trigger some sort of an emotional response, which could essentially sometimes be, difficult, having difficulty in expressing your thoughts and feelings. And these barriers can impede your communication and communication skills, and thereby sometimes it leads to anger, hostility, jealousy, negative emotions, and even fear and anxiety. So when we look at managing barriers to overcome individual learning in groups, we have to be conscious and look into all these aspects of how do we manage them, and how do we evaluate them, how do we apprise ourselves of the needs of the individuals and the students in the class, and then build our activities in such a way that allows for professional development and learner engagement. And this in a way then helps create helps create a positive dynamic in the classroom. So any questions on this so far? Great. So if there are no questions, then what I would suggest is that I would suggest some further reading that you could do, primarily, for the purposes of understanding what are the benefits of, managing the classroom in terms of classroom dynamics. There is this one particular article which I've seen on one of the websites, and this is what I would suggest that you go ahead and read, because this would allow this would allow you to essentially understand the benefits of managing classroom dynamics and how it can help build a positive classroom when you're doing the teaching and learning with your learners. So I'll catch up with you in the next session discussing learning outcome 2. Till then, I would suggest go through the copy of this particular recording for those of you who have not attended, and also look at some of the additional reading articles that I mentioned towards the end in plenary slide, and they would help you to understand the learning outcome 1 in a bit more detail. Thank you for attending, and bye for now.